I get to introduce the poet, remarkable poet Ko-un, to the city of Toronto. Among the Asian poetries, Korean poetry draws a great deal from the Confucian tradition and the Taoist tradition in Chinese poetry, draws from Japanese poetry, and has had from the beginning its own distinct, fierce and local traditions in poetry, and of course its own Hangul, language of representation. The central story of Korean poetry in the 20th century was the occupation of Korea by Japan from 1903 to 1943, a period during which the Japanese basically tried to eradicate the Korean language. Ko-un was born in a rural village in Korea in 1933. When he went to school, the Japanese administration outlawed the teaching of Korean in Korean public schools. He was taught the language surreptitiously and the Korean writing system by an elder in his own village. In those desperate years of rural poverty in the 1930s, he saw difficult behaviors among people trying to survive, and that experience in childhood was intensified by the coming of the Korean War. As a young man, malnourished, he was turned down by the Army and spent his late adolescent years working for the U.S. Navy, at first unloading shells and then later loading coffins onto ships. So he saw both ends of the way that war worked. After the war, he joined a Buddhist monastery, Son Buddhism, Korean form of Zen Buddhism, and for 10 years lived within the monastic system and wrote his first book of poems. Sometime in the 1950s, he left monastic life for a while. By his own account, became a kind of beatnik existentialist and really talented drinker in the streets of Seoul. He also taught school, created a school on Jeju Island in the south of Korea. It's a poetry of that time, like some of the poetry of the 1950s, like some of the poetry of the same age and period that Cesar Vallejo was writing for himself, another outcast in his middle period, the Trilce poems. And then in the 1980s, he became involved with the movement for democracy in Korea under the second of the three dictatorships. And during those years, became involved with the movement Minjun, a people's poetry movement. It's an interesting thing about Korean poetry in this period that because of Japanese imperialism, modernity and modernism in poetry was associated with imperialism. So politically progressive poetry tended to be conservative in technique, and politically conservative poetry tended to be experimental in technique. And it was a poetic form after 50 years of censorship, during which, as in Irish poetry and Polish poetry, every tree was a Korean tree. Every sunset and sunrise was a Korean sunset and sunrise. And in the middle of this, in some ways typical, in some ways special violence of the middle of the 20th century, some poet had to break through the different constraints. Somebody had to be the dog that bites the leash and shows everybody how to run free. And in the account that I've heard of Korean poetry, it was Ko-un who performed that feat. One part of the story is that during the years of political activism, he was arrested 4 times. During the third period of his third arrest, when Kim Dae-jung, the leader of the democracy movement, was arrested and sentenced to death, Ko-un was sentenced to life imprisonment and solitary confinement. And during that period, in a cell I've read so dark he could hardly see the glint on the coffee can that was given to him to use for latrine, he kept himself alive and gave himself work by waking up every morning in the dark and setting about the day's work of visualizing the face of every person he'd ever known, starting with the kids in his village, going up and down the street, across the street to the edge of the town, the voices of the women from the next market town that he would hear falling asleep on Sunday nights as they were going past his village to their village, gossiping and the dogs barking. And at some point, he said to himself that if he ever got out of there, he was going to write a poem about every person he ever knew. And he's now in the 13th volume of a long work called Maninbo, 10,000 lives, literally in Korean. It's the word for census. He's written novels, he's written essays. Once a democracy was in place, there was still a law that you could not mention reunification with North Korea, and you certainly couldn't go there. So, of course, Cohen set out to walk to North Korea, which that was his fourth time in prison. Allen Ginsberg called him after this in an introduction to the first book of his poems, translated to English, Beyond Self, 100 Zen Poems, called him a trickster, a jailbird, wild bodhisattva of the poem, demotic, fierce, graphomaniacal, and wholly alive. 4 books of his poems have been translated into English. A section of Maninbo, or 10,000 Lives, by Green Integer Press, the Beyond Self, the book of Buddhist poems, The Sound of My Waves, a section from across his work, and The Three-Way Tavern, another selection across his work. He's an enormously inventive writer. The range of his poetry goes from trying to make a historical account, this remarkable account of the suffering of a whole people in the 20th century, to the private Zen poems. Poems like, from memory, you think water flows downhill because the earth tilted at some point? Wrong. Everything was out of whack from the beginning. A poem called Echo that goes, sky to mountain, what are you, are you, are you, are you, are you? A poem called Drunkard that goes, I never was one thing. 6 million cells, and I'm supposed to be in charge. 6 million cells, everyone drunk. Please recommend a great writer and one of the great heroes of human freedom in the last half of the 20th century, Ko-un.
단풍 잎새를 국기로 그린 나라, 단풍을 국가로 노래하는 나라, 그리고 단풍의 대지를 시 속에서 재현하는 나라, 이 나라에 와서 나 또한 하나의 단풍 잎새가 되고 싶습니다. 감사합니다.
Let me translate. A country that has a maple leaf in its national flag. A country that has a maple tree in its national anthem. A country that represents the earth of the maples in its poetry. I've come to this country and I want to become a maple leaf too. Thank you.